The notification lit up my phone as I was washing dishes in my modest Portland apartment. I almost ignored it. It had been a long day advising clients on sustainable investments, and I was looking forward to curling up with my book. But something made me dry my hands and check the message. It was from my cousin Ryan. "Hey Emma, thought you should see this. Natalie's at it again." Attached was a video that made my stomach drop. There was my sister, wine glass in hand, surrounded by our relatives at her annual summer barbecue, an event I'd never been invited to. "Poor Emma," Natalie laughed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Still driving that ancient Honda and living in that tiny apartment. Remember when our parents thought she was the smart one?" Our relatives chuckled uncomfortably as she continued. Some financial advisor she turned out to be. Can't even manage her own money. Meanwhile, Greg and I just closed on our vacation home in Vail. I watched in stunned silence as my sister continued to paint me as the family disappointment. The video ended with her final cutting remark. The family failure, hiding behind her little reading glasses and pretending she's too intellectual for success. It's sad, really. I set my phone down, hands trembling slightly. After 15 years of being portrayed as the failure compared to my high-flying real estate developer sister, I should have been used to it. But somehow it still stung. What Natalie didn't know, what none of them knew, was just how wrong they all were. And perhaps it was finally time they learned the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I couldn't sleep that night. The soft glow of the city lights filtered through my blinds as I stared at the ceiling, replaying Natalie's words over and over in my mind. Family failure. The family disappointment. I slipped out of bed and walked to my window, looking out at the park across the street. My apartment was modest, yes. A 2-bedroom in a pleasant neighborhood with a view of towering Douglas firs and a small pond where ducks gathered each morning. I'd lived here for 8 years, even though I could have afforded something much grander. That's what Natalie never understood. I could have bought a mansion if I'd wanted to. I could have driven a luxury car instead of my reliable Honda. I could have flaunted my success the way she did, but I'd chosen a different path. After graduating with honors in finance, I'd taken a different direction than most of my peers. Instead of chasing the highest-paying corporate positions like Natalie had, I'd specialized in sustainable and ethical investing. I'd built a client base of people who, like me, believed money was a tool for security and positive impact rather than a scorecard. My firm now managed over $300 million in assets. Last year alone, my personal income had exceeded 7 figures. But unlike Natalie, I invested most of it rather than spending it on status symbols. I moved to my home office and opened my laptop, the blue light illuminating my face in the darkness. My investment portfolio appeared on screen, diverse, substantial, and reflective of my values. Properties acquired for their investment potential rather than curb appeal. Companies selected for their ethics as well as their profits. A net worth that would shock my sister into silence. But I'd never flaunted it, never corrected her assumptions, never felt the need to prove myself to family members who seemed to value marble countertops over meaningful contribution. Our parents had raised us with modest means but big dreams. When they passed away 5 years ago, Dad from heart failure, Mom from cancer just 6 months later, something fundamental had shifted between Natalie and me. Without their mediating presence, the rift had only widened. Natalie had doubled down on her material pursuit of success, while I'd retreated further into my quieter path. My phone buzzed with another message from Ryan. "Sorry to send that, Emma. Just thought you should know what she's saying. Everyone doesn't feel that way, you know." I typed back, "Thanks for looking out for me. Don't worry, I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. I was tired of being the family's cautionary tale. Tired of the pitying looks at gatherings. tired of Natalie's constant need to diminish me to elevate herself. Outside my window, the first hints of dawn were breaking over the mountains. I made a decision as the sky lightened. I wouldn't confront Natalie directly about the video. That would only feed into her narrative that I was bitter about her success. Instead, I would let the truth reveal itself naturally. The annual family reunion at Uncle Peter's lake house was coming up in 2 weeks. Natalie would be there, holding court as usual. Perhaps that would be the right time and place for a subtle but effective revelation. I made myself a cup of tea and began planning. By the time the sun had fully risen, casting my apartment in warm golden light, I had 3 calls to make. 1 to my wealth manager, 1 to Uncle Peter, and 1 to my cousin Ryan, thanking him for the video. Then I got ready for work, choosing my usual professional but understated outfit: charcoal slacks, a cream blouse, and the simple pearl earrings that had been my mother's. I wasn't flashy, but I was polished. Natalie called it boring. My clients called it reassuring. At 42, I had built a life I was proud of. I had close friends who shared my values, a career that allowed me to align my work with my ethics and financial security beyond what most people ever achieve. What I didn't have was my family's respect, at least not my sister's. And while I'd convinced myself for years that it didn't matter, the video had made it clear. It did matter. Not because I craved their approval, but because Natalie's false narrative was poisoning relationships throughout our extended family. The following Sunday, as I was returning from a hike in Forest Park, my phone rang. Natalie's name flashed on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. "Emma," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "It's been ages. How are you doing?" "I'm well," I replied, keeping my tone neutral as I unlaced my hiking boots at the door. "What can I do for you, Natalie?" "Well," she paused dramatically, "Greg and I are considering some new investment opportunities, and I thought, since you work in that field, maybe you could give us some free advice. Nothing complicated, just a quick look at some options we're considering." I nearly laughed, out loud at the audacity. After years of belittling my career and financial status, she wanted to use my professional expertise without compensation. "I'd be happy to schedule a consultation through my office," I said calmly, padding to my kitchen in sock feet. "My assistant can find a time next week. My standard fee for new clients is $500 for the initial session." There was a long pause. "Fee?" Natalie finally sputtered. "Emma, we're family. I thought you'd want to help us out." "I do value family, Natalie. That's why I'd only charge you my standard rate instead of the premium I normally apply for high net worth clients." "High net worth?" she scoffed. "Don't you think that's a bit outside your usual clientele? We need someone who understands luxury investments." I felt a calm clarity wash over me as I looked out at the park where families were enjoying the Sunday afternoon sunshine. This was the moment. The tipping point. Her continued condescension, despite asking for my help, solidified my resolve. "You know what? You're right," I said pleasantly, pouring myself a glass of water. "I'm sure you'll find someone better suited to your needs. Good luck with that vacation property in Vail. I hear the market there is quite volatile these days." I hung up before she could respond, a small smile playing on my lips. For 15 years, I'd been the accommodating sister, the one who let Natalie's jabs slide to keep the peace. No more. The annual family reunion at Uncle Peter's lake house would be in 1 week. I had preparations to make. Uncle Peter had built his sprawling cedar and glass lake house himself, perched on the edge of a pristine lake 2 hours outside Portland. As the eldest of my mother's 3 siblings and the family patriarch since my parents passed, his opinion carried weight with the extended family. I arrived early on Friday to help set up, my Honda kicking up dust on the long driveway. Uncle Peter was waiting on the porch, tall and still sturdy at 74, his silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Emma!" he called, coming down the steps to give me a bear hug. "Good to see you, kiddo. Thanks for coming early to help." "Happy to," I smiled, hugging him back. "And thanks for being open to my suggestion." He gave me a conspiratorial wink. "Been a long time coming. If you ask me, your mom would approve." As we prepared for the gathering, other family members began to arrive. I noticed several of them looking at me with that same mix of pity and awkwardness I'd grown accustomed to. Cousin Melissa asked if I'd found anyone yet, as if my single status at 42 was another failure to add to the list. Uncle David made a well-meaning but condescending comment about how not everyone is cut out for the high-powered corporate world when I mentioned my work. I smiled through it all, knowing what was coming. Natalie and Greg arrived last, of course. Their gleaming SUV rolled up the driveway as everyone else was already enjoying drinks on the deck. Natalie air-kissed relatives and made a show of admiring the lake house improvements before finally acknowledging me with a tight smile. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Emma," she nodded, looking me up and down. "Still driving that old car, I see." I noted her designer sundress, the diamond tennis bracelet, the fresh highlights in her expertly styled hair, all the trappings of success, as she defined it. "It gets me where I need to go," I replied mildly, sipping my iced tea. "Well, not all of us can afford a new car every few years," she said with faux sympathy, loud enough for nearby relatives to hear. I simply smiled and excused myself to help Uncle Peter with the grill. The stage was set. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for the right moment. Dinner was served on the expansive deck overlooking the lake. The conversation flowed along with the wine, and as the sun began to set, casting the water in shades of orange and pink, Uncle Peter stood up and tapped his glass for attention. "Before we lose the light," he announced, "I wanted to share some exciting news. As you all know, I've been thinking about what to do with this property as I get older. It's too much for one old man to maintain, but I'd hate to see it leave the family." Natalie straightened in her seat, an eager smile spreading across her face. She'd been not so subtly hinting for years that she and Greg would be happy to take the lake house off Uncle Peter's hands. "I've decided to create a family trust to maintain this property for all of us to enjoy," Uncle Peter continued. "And I've asked Emma to oversee it, given her expertise in financial management." A murmur went through the gathering. Natalie's smile froze. "In fact," Uncle Peter continued, raising his glass in my direction, "Emma has generously offered to match my initial endowment to the trust, which will ensure the property remains well-maintained for generations to come." All eyes turned to me in surprise. Natalie's jaw actually dropped. "That's very generous, Emma," Aunt Margaret said with confusion. "Can you really?" "Yes," I said simply, meeting her gaze with quiet confidence. "I'm happy to contribute. This place holds many fond memories for all of us. But that would be..." Greg began calculating aloud, his forehead creasing. "About $2 million from each of us, yes," Uncle Peter confirmed casually. The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically see the wheels turning. In everyone's minds, recalculating everything they thought they knew about me. "There must be some mistake," Natalie finally laughed, her voice strained. "Emma doesn't have that kind of money." Uncle Peter looked confused. "Emma, didn't you tell your sister about your success? She's one of the top sustainable investment advisors in the Northwest," he told Natalie. "Her firm manages over $300 million in assets." Natalie turned to me, her face pale in the fading light. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," I said calmly, meeting her gaze across the table. "I've done well for myself, Natalie. I just don't feel the need to broadcast it." "But your apartment, your car," she stammered. "I choose to live simply and invest my money rather than spend it on status symbols," I explained. It's actually one of the principles I emphasize with my clients. As the realization dawned on her face, I felt no triumph, no vindication, just a quiet certainty that things between us would never be the same, and perhaps that was exactly what we needed. The family gathering continued into the evening, but there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Relatives who had previously treated me with dismissive pity were suddenly finding reasons to sit near me, asking about my work with apparent interest. Cousin Melissa, who had earlier questioned my single status, now wanted to know all about sustainable investing. Uncle David, who had been condescending about my career choice, was explaining to everyone how forward-thinking my specialization was. Throughout it all, Natalie sat stiffly beside Greg, her expression oscillating between shock and embarrassment. She barely touched her dessert, and the wine glass that was usually never empty remained half full. The performative confidence she typically radiated had vanished, replaced by a quiet discomfort that she couldn't quite hide. I hadn't planned to humiliate her. That wasn't my goal. I had simply grown tired of the false narrative she had constructed about me, a narrative that had shaped how our entire family viewed me for years. All I wanted was for the truth to be known, for the record to be set straight. As people began to drift away from the table and gather in smaller groups around the fire pit or in the great room, I found a quiet moment to slip away to the dock. The lake was peaceful at night, the water a black mirror reflecting a scatter of stars. The air had cooled, and I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself as I sat on the wooden planks, dangling my feet above the gentle waves. "Mind if I join you?" I looked up to see Uncle Peter, holding 2 mugs of what smelled like hot chocolate spiked with something stronger. "Of course," I said, scooting over to make room beside me. He handed me one of the mugs and settled beside me with a groan. These old knees aren't what they used to be. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping our drinks. The distant laughter and conversation from the house were muted here, replaced by the soft lapping of water against the shore and the occasional call of a nightbird. "Your mother would have handled that differently," Uncle Peter finally said, his voice gentle. I smiled faintly. She would have kept it private, found a way to tell Natalie without anyone else knowing. "Maybe," he nodded, "or maybe not." Catherine had a streak of justice in her that people often overlooked. She believed in truth. "Did I do the wrong thing?" I asked, suddenly uncertain. Uncle Peter considered this, looking out across the dark water. "Wrong? No. But the question now is what happens next. The truth is out. What are you going to do with it?" It was a good question, one I hadn't fully considered. I'd been so focused on the revelation itself that I hadn't thought much about its aftermath. "I don't want to hurt her," I admitted. "I just wanted to stop being hurt by her." "Then make sure she knows that," Uncle Peter advised, patting my knee as he stood up. "Don't leave things as they are now." He left me there with my thoughts and the stars, the weight of his wisdom settling around my shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. The truth was out. Now, what would I do with it? The next morning, I woke early and went for a run along the lake shore. The sun was just cresting the hills to the east, burning off the mist that clung to the water's surface. The cool morning air filled my lungs, bringing clarity to my thoughts. When I returned to the house, sweaty and refreshed, most of the family was still asleep. In the kitchen, however, I found Natalie sitting alone at the counter, cradling a mug of coffee between her hands. She looked up when I entered, her expression unreadable. She'd always been beautiful in a polished, deliberate way, but this morning she looked worn around the edges. No makeup, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, dressed in what were probably the most casual clothes she owned, designer sweatpants and a cashmere hoodie. "Morning," I said, keeping my tone neutral as I filled a glass with water from the tap. She watched me drink it down, then finally spoke. "How long?" "How long what? How long have you been?" She struggled to find the words. Successful? Rich? Whatever you want to call it. I set down my glass. I've been doing well for about 12 years. The firm really took off around 8 years ago when ethical investing became more mainstream. And you never said anything, she said, somewhere between an accusation and a question. Would it have mattered? I asked, genuinely curious. Would it have changed how you see me? She didn't answer directly. Instead, she stared into her coffee mug and asked, "Why do you live the way you do? If you can afford better?" It was such a Natalie question. In her worldview, the entire point of having money was to display it, to use it as evidence of one's worth and success. Better is subjective, I replied, pulling out a stool to sit across from her. I like my apartment. It's close to work, overlooks the park, has exactly the space I need. My car is reliable and paid for. What would be better about a bigger place that's mostly empty rooms or a luxury car that costs a fortune to maintain? She looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. But don't you want people to know you've made it? To respect you for what you've achieved? Respect based on what I own isn't respect I particularly value, I said gently. And the people who matter to me know what I've achieved without seeing my bank statements. Natalie flinched slightly at this, perhaps recognizing herself as someone who hadn't known and hadn't bothered to find out. So this whole time, she said slowly, when I've said things about you to the family, you were wrong, I finished for her. Yes. She set down her mug with a deliberate, "Ocean, why didn't you ever correct me?" Would you have believed me? I countered. Or would you have assumed I was lying to save face? She had the grace to look ashamed. I might not have believed you. Exactly, I said, standing up to rinse my glass. And honestly, Natalie, it didn't seem important until recently. I didn't care what you or anyone else thought about my finances. What changed? She asked. I thought about the video, about years of being painted as the failure, about family gatherings where I was treated with pity rather than respect. I got tired of a false story shaping how our family sees me, I said simply. It was time for the truth. She nodded slowly, then stood up. I should get ready. Greg and I are leaving early. Of course they were, running away rather than facing the new reality. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. Natalie, I called as she reached the doorway. She paused but didn't turn around. This doesn't have to change everything, just the parts that weren't true to begin with. She nodded once, stiffly, and continued out of the kitchen without another word. An hour later, their SUV was pulling out of the driveway, dust billowing behind them as they headed back to the city well ahead of schedule. I watched from the porch, a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness settling in my chest. The truth was out, but at what cost? The days following the lake house revelation were quiet. I returned to my normal routine. Early mornings at my downtown office, client meetings, evening walks in the park, dinner with friends who knew the real me. Several family members reached out, some apologizing for believing Natalie's characterization of me, others asking for investment advice, which I politely directed to my official channels. Nothing from Natalie. A week passed, then 2. I threw myself into work, finalizing the paperwork for Uncle Peter's trust, meeting with potential new clients, and speaking at a conference on women in sustainable finance. But thoughts of my sister lingered at the edges of my consciousness. Had I made a mistake? Had I handled things poorly? Should I reach out? On a rainy Wednesday afternoon, as I was wrapping up at the office, my assistant knocked on my door. "Ms. Bennett is here to see you," she said, looking slightly confused. She doesn't have an appointment, but she insisted it's important. I set down my pen. "Natalie's here? Should I tell her you're busy?" My assistant asked, clearly picking up on my surprise. "No," I said, straightening the papers on my desk. "Send her in." A moment later, Natalie appeared in my doorway. She was dressed in her standard professional attire, tailored blazer, silk blouse, designer slacks, but something about her seemed different. Less polished, perhaps, more authentic. "Nice office," she said, looking around at the minimalist space with its large windows overlooking the city. I expected something more austere. "We can't all work in cubicles," I replied with a small smile, gesturing for her to sit. "What brings you here, Natalie?" She sat across from me, setting her designer handbag on the floor beside her chair. For a moment, she simply studied me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. "I've been thinking," she finally said, "about what you said at the lake house, about things changing that weren't true to begin with." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "The thing is," she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I don't know how to go back from this. I've spent years telling everyone, telling myself, a story about who you are, who I am in comparison. I don't know how to just erase all that." "I don't expect you to erase anything," I said carefully. "Just to move forward with the truth instead of fiction." She twisted her wedding ring absently. "It's not that simple. You have to understand, Emma. My whole identity has been built around being the successful sister, the one who made the right choices. If that's not true, then what does that make? Me?" Her vulnerability caught me off guard. For as long as I could remember, Natalie had been confident to the point of arrogance, certain of her place in the world and her superiority within it. To see her questioning her identity was like watching a fortress develop cracks in its walls. "It makes you human," I said gently. "It makes you someone who chose a different path than I did. Not better or worse, just different." She shook, her head slightly. "Not according to Dad." "What do you mean?" Natalie's eyes met mine, and I was startled to see them glistening with unshed tears. "Do you know what Dad said to me before he died?" I shook my head. "He said he was proud of me for my success, but that he admired you for your integrity. His last words of advice to me were to be more like Emma." She laughed bitterly. "I'd done everything right. The prestigious job, the perfect husband, the beautiful house. And he still preferred your choices." I sat back, stunned. In all our sibling rivalry, all our differences, I'd never imagined that Natalie might be carrying a wound like this. "Natalie, I'm sure he didn't mean—" "No, he was right," she interrupted, wiping discreetly at her eyes. "The thing is, Emma, I'm exhausted. Do you have any idea how hard it is to maintain the life I've created? The appearances, the constant pressure to have more, be more, show more?" I realized suddenly that I'd never really considered Natalie's life from her perspective. I'd seen only the external trappings of her success, the material wealth, the status markers. I'd never thought about what it might cost her to maintain that facade. "Tell me," I said quietly. She took a deep breath. "Greg and I are in debt. A lot of debt. The Vail property is mortgaged to the hilt. We're barely keeping up with appearances." She looked down at her perfectly manicured hands. "Every time I put you down, it was really just to convince myself that my choices were better, that I was winning." "Life isn't a competition," I said gently. "It always felt that way between us," she admitted. "Maybe that's on me. But seeing you at the lake house, so calm, so unbothered by what anyone thought, I realized you actually are free in a way I'm not." I'd never seen my sister like this, stripped of her usual defenses, showing a vulnerability I wasn't sure she even knew she possessed. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, we were having a real conversation. "What do you want, Natalie?" I asked. "Why are you here?" She squared her shoulders, as if gathering courage. "I want your help, professional help. Greg and I need to figure out how to get our finances under control, how to live more sustainably." She smiled faintly at the unintended pun. I'm not asking for charity. We'll pay your rates. You want me as your financial advisor? I clarified, still processing the request. Yes, she nodded firmly. You're clearly good at what you do. And more importantly, your family. I trust you. The irony was almost too much. After years of dismissing my career and financial choices, she was now asking for my professional guidance. But beneath my initial surprise, I felt something else. A tentative hope that this could be a beginning rather than an end. I'd have to treat you like any other client, I warned. Complete transparency, following my recommendations even when they're difficult, no special treatment. I understand, she said. That's exactly what we need. I studied her for a moment longer, looking for any sign of insincerity or manipulation. Finding none, I nodded. All right. Have Trisha set up an appointment on your way out, and bring all your financial statements. Everything. We'll need a complete picture to develop a plan. Relief washed over her face. Thank you, Emma. As she stood to leave, she hesitated, then rounded the desk and did something she hadn't done in years. She hugged me. It was brief and awkward, but genuine. I'm sorry, she whispered. For everything. After she left, I sat at my desk for a long time, looking out at the rain-washed city below. The truth was out, and against all expectations, it hadn't destroyed my relationship with my sister. It had created an opportunity to rebuild it on more solid ground. 2 weeks later, Natalie and Greg sat across from me in my conference room, surrounded by statements, budgets, and projections. Their financial situation was worse than I'd imagined. Multiple mortgages, credit card debt, personal loans, all used to maintain a lifestyle that looked impressive but was built on financial quicksand. So that's where we stand, I concluded after walking them through my analysis. You're over-leveraged, undersaved, and spending approximately 30% more than your combined income each year. Greg, a handsome man whose charm had always seemed superficial to me, looked genuinely shaken. When you lay it all out like this, it's sobering. That's the point, I said, not unkindly. You can't address what you don't acknowledge. Natalie straightened in her chair. So, what do we do? What's the plan? I slid a folder across the table. This is my recommendation. It's not going to be easy. They opened it together, scanning the document I'd prepared. Their expressions shifted from concern to disbelief as they read through my suggestions. Sell the Vail property? Natalie looked up, aghast. That's our vacation home. That you visit twice a year and cost you a fortune to maintain, I pointed out. It's your biggest liability right now. And our primary residence? Greg asked, frowning. You're suggesting we downsize? Your mortgage is 3 times what would be reasonable for your income, I explained. You're house poor. All your money goes to maintaining a home that's much larger than you need. Natalie closed the folder, pressing her lips together. This seems extreme. It's reality, I said firmly. You asked for my professional advice, and this is it. You can't keep living beyond your means and expect different results. But what will people think? Natalie asked, voicing the concern that I knew was foremost in her mind. If we sell the vacation home, downsize our house, they'll think you're making smart financial decisions, I replied. Or they won't think about it at all because most people are too focused on their own lives to obsess over yours. Greg let out a short laugh. She's got a point, Nat. Natalie shot him a look, then turned back to me. And the rest of these suggestions? Cutting back on restaurants, travel, shopping? Basic budgeting, I nodded. Spending less than you earn is Finance 101. She took a deep breath, then looked at Greg. Some unspoken communication passed between them, and he nodded slightly. Okay, she said, turning back to me. We'll do it. All of it. But I need your help, Emma. I don't know how to live differently. How to be different. It was such a naked admission of vulnerability that I felt my professional demeanor soften slightly. I'll help you, I promised. That's what sisters are for. And for the first time in years, Natalie smiled at me without a trace of competition or resentment. Just simple gratitude and perhaps the tentative beginnings of respect. As they gathered their things to leave, Natalie hung back while Greg stepped out to take a call. I told Clara, she said quietly, referring to her teenage daughter, about our financial situation and how Aunt Emma is helping us. She said something interesting. She said she always thought you were the coolest aunt because you seemed happy with simple things. A faint smile touched her lips. Kids notice that stuff, I guess. It was a small comment, but it represented a significant shift in Natalie's perspective. A recognition that value isn't always measured in dollars or possessions. As she left my office, I felt a cautious optimism take root. The truth hadn't just cleared away falsehoods. It had created space for something new to grow. 6 months passed quicker than I expected. Autumn turned to winter, and the rainy Portland days grew shorter. Through my office window, I watched the park's trees lose their leaves, then stand stark against gray skies, and finally begin to bud again as spring approached. Throughout these months, Natalie and I settled into a new kind of relationship. Not the close sisterhood we'd never truly had, but something more honest than what had existed before. Our bi-weekly financial counseling sessions had evolved from strictly professional to cautiously personal. Greg had embraced the changes with surprising enthusiasm once he understood the math. He'd been the one to push forward with selling the Vail property, which closed just before Christmas. They'd listed their primary residence in January and accepted an offer in February. Now, in early March, they were preparing to move into a charming craftsman home, half the size of their previous house, but with character and warmth their McMansion had lacked. I hadn't expected the depth of resistance from Natalie about the house. It wasn't just about downsizing, it was about what she perceived as public failure. During one particularly difficult session in my office, she finally broke down. People. We'll talk, she said, gripping the armrests of her chair. Everyone will know we couldn't afford to keep our house. Or they'll assume you're making a lifestyle choice, I countered. Empty nesters often downsize. It's perfectly normal. She shook her head. You don't understand, Emma. My friends, my social circle, they measure success by square footage and zip codes. This will be humiliating. I studied my sister across the desk. Even in crisis, she was perfectly put together. Hairstyled, makeup flawless, clothes expensive. But the carefully constructed facade couldn't hide the anxiety in her eyes. Then maybe you need new friends, I suggested gently. People who value you for who you are, not what you own. She laughed bitterly. That's easy for you to say. You've always been self-contained. You don't need people's approval. Everyone needs connection, I said. I just choose to connect with people who share my values, not my tax bracket. This seemed to give her pause. Like who? Come to dinner Friday, I offered impulsively. I'm hosting some friends. See for yourself. To my surprise, she accepted. Friday evening found Natalie arriving at my apartment building, looking up at its modest facade with new eyes. No longer viewing it through a lens of superiority, she seemed curious, perhaps even a bit nervous. Your building has character, she observed as I welcomed her in. 1920s construction, I nodded. Hardwood floors, high ceilings, solid walls. They don't build them like this anymore. She followed me inside, glancing around with undisguised curiosity. I saw my home through her eyes, the built-in bookshelves filled with well-read volumes, the comfortable furniture arranged for conversation rather than to impress. The collection, of local art on the walls, the large windows showcasing the park view. It's cozy, she said, which from Natalie was practically a rave review. It's home, I replied simply. My friends arrived in quick succession: Maya, an environmental lawyer; Daniel, a university professor; Renee, who ran a local nonprofit; and Jack, a chef who owned a small farm-to-table restaurant. None of them wore designer clothes or arrived in luxury cars, but all greeted Natalie warmly when I introduced her as my sister. Over dinner, a simple but delicious meal I'd prepared myself, the conversation flowed easily from local politics to books to environmental issues to travel stories. No one mentioned property values or stock portfolios. No one compared watches or handbags. Instead, they debated ideas, shared experiences, and laughed genuinely at each other's stories. I watched Natalie throughout the evening. Initially stiff and slightly awkward, she gradually relaxed, even contributing to the conversation about a book she'd recently read. By dessert, she was engaged in a spirited discussion with Renee about community gardens, something she'd apparently been researching for their new, smaller yard. As the evening wound down and my friends departed, Natalie lingered, helping me clear the dishes despite my protests. "Your friends are interesting," she said as she handed me a plate to dry. "They're good people," I agreed. Authentic. She scrubbed a pan with unnecessary vigor. "They don't seem impressed by you being a successful financial advisor." I laughed. "They're impressed by what I do with that success, not the success itself." Maya and I serve on the same environmental coalition board. Daniel and I are working on a financial literacy program for his students. Jack sources sustainable investments for his restaurant through my firm. "They know you for who you are," she said softly, "not what you have." "Yes," I nodded. "That's friendship." She handed me the clean pan and turned to face me fully. "I don't think I have friends like that, Emma. I have people I socialize with, people I want to impress or who impress me, but not this." The raw honesty of her admission caught me off guard. For the first time, I felt a genuine pang of sympathy for my sister. In her pursuit of status and appearances, she'd missed out on the authentic connections that had enriched my life beyond measure. "It's never too late to change that," I said, setting down my dish towel. "Starting over in a new house could be an opportunity to build different kinds of relationships, too." She nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe." As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Thank you for tonight. For letting me see this part of your life." "Anytime," I replied, surprised to find I meant it. The moving day for Natalie and Greg arrived on a surprisingly sunny Saturday in March. I hadn't planned to help, assuming they'd hire people, but received a text from Natalie the night before. "Could use an extra pair of hands tomorrow if you're free. Professional movers handling the big stuff, but there's plenty of small things." I arrived at their old house to find it half empty, moving boxes stacked in the entryway. Natalie was in the kitchen, wrapping glassware and newspaper. "Thanks for coming," she said, looking up briefly. "Greg's at the new place directing traffic. Clara's supposedly packing her room, but I suspect she's mostly texting friends and complaining." I set down my coffee. "Put me to work." For the next few hours, we worked side by side, wrapping, packing, and labeling. It was the longest we'd spent together, just the two of us, in years. Surprisingly, it wasn't uncomfortable. We fell into an easy rhythm, occasionally sharing memories prompted by objects we uncovered. "Remember these?" Natalie held up a set of crystal candlesticks. "Mom's wedding gift to us." "She was so proud of those," I smiled. "Saved for months to buy them." Natalie ran her finger along the cut crystal. "I never used them. Thought they weren't fancy enough." She shook her head slightly. "Mom would have been disappointed." "Use them in the new house," I suggested. "Start fresh." She nodded, wrapping them carefully. "I will." By mid-afternoon, we'd finished the kitchen and moved to the home office. As Natalie sorted through papers, she suddenly paused, holding a folder. "What's that?" I asked, noticing her expression change. "Dad's will," she said quietly, "and some letters he wrote before he died." We both fell silent. The loss of our parents still felt raw sometimes, despite the years that had passed. "Did you ever read his letter to you?" she asked. I nodded. "Several times." She hesitated, then pulled out a sheet of paper. "I never showed this to anyone," she said, holding it out to me. "But maybe you should read it." I took the paper carefully. It was our father's distinctive handwriting, slightly shaky from the illness that eventually took him. "My dearest Natalie," it began. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone." There are things a father should tell his daughter while he has the chance. But some truths are easier to write than to speak. I glanced at Natalie, who nodded for me to continue. "You have always been my ambitious one, my fierce achiever. From the time you were small, you wanted to win, to be the best, to have the most. That drive has brought you material success beyond what your mother and I could have imagined for you. But I worry, my dear one, that somewhere along the way, you've confused having with being." I paused, feeling like I was intruding on something deeply personal. "It's okay," Natalie said softly. "Keep reading. Your sister Emma approaches life differently. She measures wealth not by what she accumulates, but by the freedom it brings her to live according to her values. I've watched you compete with her your entire life, but you've been competing in a race she isn't running." I looked up, meeting Natalie's eyes. They were bright with unshed tears. "My wish for you," the letter continued, "is that you find the courage to define success on your own terms, to build a life rich in meaning, not just in possessions, to be more like Emma in the ways that matter most, authentic, purposeful, content." I carefully folded the letter and handed it back to her. "I had no idea," I said quietly. She tucked the letter back into the folder. "That's why I was so angry at the lake house. When Uncle Peter announced your involvement with the trust, all I could hear was Dad's voice telling me again that you were better, that I should be more like you." "That's not what he meant," I said gently. "I know that now," she nodded. "He wasn't comparing us. He was trying to help me see what I was missing." She gestured around at the half-empty house. "All of this, it was never going to be enough, because it wasn't what I really needed." We finished packing in companionable silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As we loaded the last boxes into my car, Natalie turned to take a final look at the imposing house that had been her showpiece for the past decade. "Goodbye, Money Pit," she said with unexpected humor. "Hello, financial stability?" I laughed, surprised by her lightness. "Ready for the next chapter?" She nodded, sliding into the passenger seat. More ready than I expected. The new house was indeed smaller but charming, with a wraparound porch and a mature garden. Greg was directing the placement of furniture when we arrived, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. Clara, their teenage daughter, was arranging books on built-in shelves in the living room, seemingly less sullen about the move than Natalie had implied. "Aunt Emma," she exclaimed when she saw me, "did Mom drag you into this chaos too?" "Volunteered," I corrected, setting down a box. "I like what you're doing with the books." She shrugged but looked pleased. "This house has better vibes than the old one. More like a real home, you know?" Out of the mouths of teenagers. We spent the rest of the day unpacking essentials and ordering pizza when everyone was too tired to cook. As dusk fell, we gathered on the porch with glasses of wine, sparkling water for Clara, surveying the quiet, tree-lined street. "To new beginnings," Greg proposed, raising his glass. "To living within our means," Natalie added with a small smile in my direction. "To family." I finished, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring evening. As I drove home later that night, I reflected on the strange path that had led us here. 6 months ago, Natalie had been mocking me behind my back, dismissing my life choices while presenting herself as the successful sister. Now she was following my financial advice, downsizing her life, and beginning to question the values that had driven her for decades. It wasn't a complete transformation. Natalie would always care more about appearances than I did. She'd always have a taste for luxury and status. But beneath those familiar traits, I glimpsed something new emerging, a willingness to examine her choices, to consider alternative definitions of success, to build a life based on something more substantial than acquisition. The next month brought more changes. Uncle Peter's lake house trust was finalized, ensuring the property would remain in the family for generations. I'd established a transparent management structure that involved several family members, with quarterly reports to keep everyone informed. The trust's first family weekend was scheduled for Memorial Day, and to my surprise, Natalie volunteered to help organize it. "I thought you'd be too busy with settling into the new place," I said when she called with the offer. "I need to contribute. Something," she replied. After all these years of just taking family hospitality for granted, it's time I gave back. This new Natalie, thoughtful, considerate, mindful of reciprocity, still surprised me sometimes. My professional life continued to thrive, with new clients seeking ethical investment opportunities and my firm's assets under management growing steadily. I'd begun mentoring younger women in finance, something I found unexpectedly fulfilling. One evening, as I was leaving a meeting with a particularly promising mentee, I spotted an unexpected figure in my office reception area. "Clara?" I said, surprised to see my niece sitting there, backpack at her feet. "Is everything okay?" She stood, looking slightly nervous. "Yeah, everything's fine. I came to talk to you, if you have time." "Of course," I said, leading her back to my office. "What's up?" She settled into a chair, fidgeting with her phone case. At 17, Clara was a striking combination of both her parents, Natalie's classic beauty with Greg's more relaxed demeanor. She'd always been polite to me but distant, clearly influenced by her mother's attitude. "I have a school project," she finally said, "about careers. We're supposed to interview someone in a field we might be interested in." I raised an eyebrow, trying to hide my surprise. "And you chose financial advising?" She shrugged, attempting nonchalance but not quite succeeding. "I'm good at math, and I like the idea of helping people with their money, especially the sustainable investing part you do." She glanced up at me. "Plus, Mom says you're the smartest person she knows, so—" I nearly dropped my pen. "Your mom said that?" Clara nodded. "She talks about you differently now. She says you taught her what real success looks like." I sat back, momentarily speechless. After years of competition and criticism, this kind of acknowledgement from Natalie, even secondhand, was unprecedented. "Anyway," Clara continued, pulling out a notebook, "I have some questions if that's okay." For the next hour, I answered Clara's surprisingly insightful questions about education requirements, day-to-day responsibilities, ethical considerations, and career satisfaction. As she packed up to leave, she hesitated. "Can I ask you something personal, Aunt Emma?" "Sure," I nodded. "Were you ever mad at Mom? For how she treated you before?" I considered my answer carefully. "I was hurt," I finally admitted. "But I think your mom was hurting too, in her own way. Sometimes people look down on others because they're insecure about their own choices." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "She's different now. Happier, I think, even though we have less stuff." She stood, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "Thanks for doing this. It was cool." "Anytime," I smiled. "I mean that." After she left, I sat at my desk for a long time, thinking about how far we'd come in 6 months. From a hurtful video and years of resentment to genuine change and reconnection. It wasn't perfect. Relationships rarely are. But it was authentic. In a way our family hadn't been for a very long time. The following Sunday, Natalie invited me to dinner at their new home. The smaller dining room was cozy, lit by candles in what I recognized as our mother's crystal candlesticks. The meal was simple but thoughtfully prepared, and the conversation flowed easily among the four of us. No pretense, no competition, no underlying tension. After dinner, while Greg and Clara cleaned up, another new development, Natalie led me to the backyard where spring flowers were beginning to bloom around a small patio. "We're paying off the last credit card next month," she said without preamble. "Ahead of schedule." "That's excellent," I replied. "How does it feel?" "Liberating," she admitted. I never realized how much mental space was occupied by financial worry. She looked out at the garden thoughtfully. I still can't believe how blind I was about money, how I confused spending with security. "Most people do," I said. "Our entire economy is built on that confusion." She turned to me, her expression earnest. "Thank you, Emma. Not just for the financial help, but for not giving up on me, even when I was awful to you." "You're my sister," I said simply. "That matters more than any disagreement." "I wish I'd understood that sooner," she said, softly. "All those years wasted on jealousy and competition." "They weren't wasted if they led us here," I pointed out. She nodded slowly. "I'm thinking of volunteering at Clara's school. They need help with financial literacy education for seniors. Given what I've learned the hard way, I might actually have something valuable to offer." "That's a wonderful idea," I said, genuinely impressed by this new direction. "Would you—" she hesitated. "Would you help me put together some materials? Maybe come as a guest speaker sometimes?" "I'd love to," I replied without hesitation. As the evening sky deepened to indigo above us, I realized that the accidental revelation of my net worth hadn't just corrected a false narrative about me. It had created an opportunity for Natalie to rewrite her own story, to redefine success on more meaningful terms, to build authentic relationships, to find purpose beyond acquisition. And in doing so, it had given us both something neither money nor status could buy, a genuine connection as sisters. A month later, as I prepared for the Memorial Day family gathering at Uncle Peter's lake house, I received a text from Natalie. "Need a ride this weekend? Thought we could drive up together." I smiled at my phone. "Sounds perfect," I typed back. "Just like old times." Except it wouldn't be like old times at all. It would be something new, something better, something true. Sometimes accidental revelations turn out to be exactly what we need, not to prove others wrong, but to help everyone find their way to what's right. A full year had passed since the lake house revelation. It felt strange to think that 12 months ago I had been seething over that video of Natalie mocking me to our family. Now, as I prepared for this year's family reunion at Uncle Peter's, the dynamics couldn't have been more different. The trust for the lake house was running smoothly. I'd established quarterly family newsletters detailing the property maintenance, upcoming gatherings, and financial status. What had once been Uncle Peter's personal retreat had become a true family gathering place, with different branches of the family booking weekends throughout the year. I arrived early Friday afternoon, my Honda climbing the familiar winding road. The lake sparkled in the summer sun, and wildflowers dotted the surrounding meadows. Uncle Peter was waiting on the porch as always, but this time Natalie's car was already parked in the driveway. "She beat you here," Uncle Peter said with a wink as he hugged me. "Said she wanted to help set up." I raised an eyebrow. "Natalie? Voluntarily doing setup work?" He chuckled. "People change, Emma. Sometimes for the better." I found my sister in the kitchen, arranging platters of fresh fruit and local cheeses. She looked different somehow, still well-dressed but in a more relaxed way. Her designer jeans paired with a simple linen shirt, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. "There you are," she said, looking up with a genuine smile. "I was beginning to think you got lost." "Just surprised to see you here early," I replied, setting down my bags. "Especially doing food prep." She laughed. "I know. Shocking, right? But turns out I actually enjoy this stuff when I'm not trying to impress anyone." She handed me a knife. "Here, make yourself useful. The tomatoes need slicing." We worked side by side, preparing for the weekend's festivities. There was an ease between us now that had never existed before. Not the forced politeness of our childhood, nor the tense competition of our adult years, but something approaching genuine companionship. "How's the new financial literacy program going?" I asked as I sliced heirloom tomatoes for the evening salad. Natalie's face lit up. "Really well. We've got 20 seniors signed up for the fall semester, and the principal wants to make it mandatory for graduation next year." She arranged olives on a platter with careful attention. "I never thought I'd enjoy teaching, but it's surprisingly rewarding. These kids have no idea how credit cards work or what compound interest means." "You're making a real difference," I said, genuinely impressed by how she'd embraced this new direction. "Well, I had a good teacher," she replied, bumping my shoulder lightly with hers. "By the way, can you still come speak to the class next month? The students were excited when I mentioned you might visit." "Already on my calendar," I assured her. When the rest of the family began arriving that evening, I observed with interest how differently they interacted with both of us. The pity, once directed at me, had disappeared, replaced by genuine respect. More surprisingly, the somewhat artificial deference once paid to Natalie had shifted to more authentic appreciation. Cousin Melissa, who had once asked condescendingly about my single status, now sought my advice about her own retirement planning. Uncle David, who had dismissed my career choice, proudly introduced me to his new wife as our family's financial genius. But the most significant change was in how everyone interacted with Natalie. Instead of the slightly tense admiration, mixed with envy that had previously colored family interactions with her, there was now genuine warmth. People seemed to actually enjoy her company rather than simply being impressed by her. During dinner on the deck that first evening, I watched as she listened intently to Aunt Margaret's story about her community garden, offering thoughtful questions, rather than finding a way to steer the conversation back to her own accomplishments. When Clara and the other teenage cousins mentioned a local environmental initiative they wanted to join, Natalie offered to help them research funding options, drawing on her new financial literacy expertise. "Your sister's different, Uncle," Peter observed quietly as we stood by the grill later that evening. "Happier, I think." "She is," I agreed. "It's been quite a journey." He nodded sagely. "Sometimes people need to lose what they think matters to find what actually does." Later that night, after most of the family had retired to their rooms, Natalie and I found ourselves alone on the dock, much as I had been with Uncle Peter a year ago. The lake was calm, reflecting a sky brilliant with stars. We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the shore. "I've been thinking about Dad's letter," Natalie said finally. "About competing in a race you weren't running." I waited, giving her space to continue. "I spent so many years trying to prove I was more successful than you," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Better house, better car, better clothes, better lifestyle. I needed everyone to see me as the winner." "And now?" I prompted when she fell silent. She turned to look at me, her face silvered by moonlight. "Now I realize you weren't even on the same track. You weren't trying to accumulate the most things or impress the most people. You were building something completely different. A life. With purpose, with real connections, with integrity." I was touched by her insight, by how far she'd come in understanding not just me, but herself. "The funny thing is," she continued, Once I stopped trying to win that particular race, I started finding satisfaction in things I never valued before. Teaching those kids, volunteering at the community garden, having friends over for a simple dinner instead of showing off with some elaborate catered affair. She shook her head slightly. It's like I was so busy proving my worth through possessions that I never developed anything of actual worth within myself. That's not true, I said gently. You've always been smart, determined, charismatic. Those qualities just got channeled into status seeking because that's what you thought mattered. She considered this. Maybe, but I like who I'm becoming more than who I was. Me too, I admitted with a smile. She laughed, then grew serious again. I apologized to Clara recently for the example I set, for teaching her that external validation was the most important thing in life. How did she take it? Better than I expected. She said she always felt pressure to be perfect, to have the right friends, the right clothes, the right everything. She said she's happier now that I'm not micromanaging her image. Natalie sighed. I didn't realize how much damage I was doing trying to make her into a mini-me. You were parenting the way you thought was right, I offered. I was parenting from insecurity, she corrected. From fear that if she wasn't visibly successful, it would reflect badly on me. She looked out at the dark water. She's talking about studying environmental science in college now. A year ago, I would have pushed her toward business or law, something prestigious. Now I'm just proud of her for finding her own path. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, not the brittle pride of someone whose child reflects well on them, but the deep satisfaction of seeing a young person discover their authentic interests. You're a good mother, Natalie, I said quietly. You always have been, in your own way. She reached over and squeezed my hand, a rare gesture of physical affection between us. Thanks for seeing the best in me, even when I was at my worst. With you. We sat in companionable silence until the night air grew too chilly to ignore. As we walked back to the house together, I felt a sense of completion, as if a circle that had been broken for decades had finally closed. The next morning brought perfect summer weather. After breakfast, most of the family headed to the lake for swimming and kayaking. I was just about to join them when my phone rang, a client with an urgent question about market fluctuations. By the time I finished the call, everyone was already in the water or scattered around the property. I was heading down to the dock when I noticed Natalie sitting alone on a bench overlooking the lake, a strangely pensive expression on her face. Something in her posture, a certain tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes, made me change direction. Everything okay? I asked, settling beside her. She startled slightly, then composed herself. Just thinking. Dangerous. Pastime, I teased gently. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I received a job offer yesterday. I didn't want to mention it during family time, but it's been on my mind. That's great, I said, surprised. Natalie had been focused on her volunteer work and financial literacy teaching for months, with no mention of returning to paid employment. What kind of position? Development Director for the Northwest Environmental Coalition, she said, naming a prestigious regional organization. They were impressed by the fundraising I did for Clara's school environmental program. The salaries? Decent. Nothing like what I used to make in real estate development, but solid. And the work aligns with values I've come to care about. It sounds perfect for you, I said, genuinely pleased. Your networking skills and fundraising experience would be invaluable to them. She nodded absently, still looking out at the lake where Greg was teaching one of the younger cousins to kayak. It would mean turning my volunteer work into a career, using my skills for something meaningful instead of just selling luxury properties to wealthy investors. So, what's holding you back? I asked, sensing her hesitation. She was quiet for a long moment. Pride, I think, or its aftermath. I don't understand. She turned to face me fully. For so many years, I defined success in such a specific way. Executive title, corner office, prestigious address, luxury car. I judged everyone, especially you, by those standards. She sighed. Now I'm considering a nonprofit job with a modest salary, working for an environmental cause I would have dismissed as impractical idealism just a year ago. And that feels like admitting you were wrong all along? I guessed. Exactly. She nodded. It feels like the final surrender of my old identity, like I'm proving you were right and I was wrong about what matters. She looked down at her hands. I know that sounds petty. It sounds human, I corrected. Change is hard, especially when it challenges how we've defined ourselves for decades. I want to take the job, she admitted. I think I'd be good at it, and I know the work matters. But part of me still struggles with how it looks. Development. Director at a nonprofit versus executive vice president at a luxury real estate firm. Who are you worried about impressing? I asked gently. She laughed softly. Old habits die hard, I guess. My former colleagues, some of our extended family, people who used to envy my success. Do their opinions matter more than your fulfillment? She shook her head. No, at least they shouldn't. She sighed. I need to get over myself, don't I? Or maybe just be gentle with yourself, I suggested. It's okay to acknowledge that this transition is challenging. You're redefining success on entirely new terms. That's not easy. You make it look easy, she said, a hint of the old competitiveness creeping into her voice. It wasn't, I replied honestly. When I chose my career path focusing on sustainable investments rather than maximum profit, plenty of my business school classmates thought I was making a mistake. When I decided to live simply and invest rather than flaunt my wealth, some people assumed I wasn't successful. I just decided their opinions mattered less than living according to my values. When did you get so wise? She asked with a small smile. Around the same time you got so introspective, I countered. She laughed, a genuine sound that lightened the mood. I'm going to take the job, she decided, and I'm going to stop caring about whether it impresses people who measure worth by square footage and car brands. Good, I nodded. The coalition will be lucky to have you. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the family enjoy the lake. Then Natalie turned to me, her expression suddenly serious. I need to tell you something else, she said. Something I've never told anyone. I waited, curious. The reason I was so competitive with you, so dismissive of your choices. She hesitated, then pushed forward. It wasn't just about Dad's approval or social status. It was because I was jealous. Jealous? I repeated, genuinely surprised. Of what? Of your certainty, she said simply. You always seemed to know exactly who you were and what mattered to you, while I was constantly shifting, trying to figure out what would make me feel successful, what would finally be enough. Or she shook her head slightly. Even when we were teenagers, you had this quiet confidence about your path. I kept waiting for external validation to give me that same security, but it never came. I was stunned by this revelation. All those years I'd assumed Natalie looked down on me, when in reality, a part of her had been envying something fundamental about my approach to life. I wasn't always as certain as I appeared, I admitted. I just learned to trust my internal compass, rather than external metrics. Well, I'm finally developing mine, she said with a determined nod. Better late than never, right? Definitely, I agreed. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but Natalie's confession stayed with me. How strange to think that while I had sometimes envied her material success and social confidence, she had been envying my sense of purpose and internal validation. We had each seen in the other something we felt we lacked in ourselves. The remainder of the family. Weekend passed in a blur of swimming, hiking, shared meals, and genuine connection. On Sunday afternoon, as people began packing up to leave, Uncle Peter gathered everyone on the deck for an announcement. "Before you all go," he said, his voice still strong despite his advancing years, "I want to share some news. I've been working with Emma on updating the trust arrangements for this property, and we've made an important addition." He gestured for me to join him, and I stood somewhat reluctantly. I'd never enjoyed being the center of attention. "Emma has done an exceptional job managing the trust this past year," Uncle Peter continued, "but we've decided the responsibility should be shared. So I'm pleased to announce that Natalie will be joining her as co-trustee, bringing her organizational skills and newly developed financial literacy expertise to the role." A ripple of surprise and approval went through the gathered family members. Natalie's eyes widened. We had discussed the possibility, but she hadn't known Uncle Peter would announce it today. "The two of them together," he said with evident satisfaction, "represent the best of our family's values. Emma's long-standing commitment to ethical financial management and Natalie's impressive ability to grow and adapt. I can't think of better hands to leave our family legacy in." As applause broke out, I caught Natalie's eye across the deck. The pure joy and validation in her expression brought a lump to my throat. This wasn't about material success or status symbols. This was recognition of her genuine transformation, her hard-won growth, her willingness to change. Later, as we helped Uncle Peter close up the house, he pulled us both into a hug. "Your parents would be so proud," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Not of what you've achieved, though that's impressive enough, but of who you've become. And most of all, that you found your way back to being sisters in the truest sense." As Natalie and I drove our separate cars back toward Portland that evening, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. A hurtful video, a revealing moment, a year of transformation. The story could have gone very differently, could have ended in permanent estrangement or deepened resentment. Instead, it had become a story of redemption, of growth, of finding authentic connection after years of competition and misunderstanding. Not because I had proven Natalie wrong about my success, but because that revelation had created space for both of us to re-examine what success truly meant. The next morning, as I prepared for a meeting with new clients interested in sustainable investing, I received a text from Natalie. "First day at the new job. Nervous but excited. Thanks for believing I could change." I smiled as I typed my reply. "You always had it in you. Some wealth is measured in net worth, but the most valuable kind is measured in growth, purpose, and connection. By those metrics, you're the richest person I know." She sent back a simple heart emoji, something the old Natalie would never have done. As I drove to my office, I reflected on the irony that had shaped our story. For years, Natalie had told everyone I was the family failure because I didn't display the material trappings of success. Yet in the end, the revelation of my net worth hadn't been important because it proved her wrong. It had been important because it had forced her to question her own definition of success, and in doing so, had set her free to discover a more meaningful measure of what it means to live a rich life. Sometimes being misunderstood is the price we pay for living authentically. And sometimes, if we're fortunate, the truth has a way of revealing itself at exactly the right moment. Not to prove others wrong, but to guide everyone toward what's right. 2 years had passed since that fateful family reunion when my financial success had been revealed. So much had changed that sometimes it felt like I was living in an entirely different reality. My investment firm had continued to grow, now managing over $500 million in ethical investments. I'd expanded to a larger office downtown and hired 3 new advisors who shared my philosophy. But the most profound changes weren't professional, they were personal. My relationship with Natalie had evolved into something neither of us could have imagined possible. The competitive tension that had defined our interactions for decades had transformed into mutual respect and genuine affection. We weren't just sisters by blood anymore. We had become friends by choice. Natalie had flourished in her role as development director at the Northwest Environmental Coalition. Her natural networking abilities and strategic thinking had helped the organization exceed their fundraising goals 2 years running. More importantly, she had found purpose in work that aligned with evolving values, something her luxury real estate career had never provided. On a crisp October morning, I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office when my assistant knocked on my door. "Your sister's here," she said, a slight puzzlement in her tone. "She says it's important but not an emergency." Natalie rarely came to my office unannounced. Our regular lunch dates and family dinners provided plenty of opportunities to catch up. "Send her in," I said, setting aside my work. Natalie entered, looking polished as always in a tailored blazer and simple jewelry, a far cry from the ostentatious designer outfits she once favored. But there was something different about her today. An energy, a nervousness that seemed out of character. "Sorry to barge in," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "But I needed to talk to you, and this felt too important for text. Or phone." "Everything okay?" I asked, concerned by her intensity. "More than okay," she smiled. "I've been offered a promotion, executive director of the entire coalition." "Natalie, that's fantastic," I exclaimed. "Congratulations." "Thanks." She nodded, but her expression remained complicated. "It's a significant step up in responsibility. The current ED is retiring after 15 years, big shoes to fill." "Which you're more than capable of doing," I assured her. "They wouldn't have offered if they didn't believe that." "That's just it," she said, leaning forward. "They believe in me in a way I'm not sure I believe in myself." This position, it's not just fundraising and networking. It's setting the strategic direction for an organization that makes real impact across 5 states. It's testifying before state legislatures, speaking at conferences, making decisions that affect conservation efforts, climate initiatives, environmental justice programs. I studied my sister carefully. "And you're worried you're not qualified?" "I'm worried," she said slowly, "that I'm still doing this for the wrong reasons." "What do you mean?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair, a gesture so uncharacteristically vulnerable that it underscored her internal struggle. "When I was offered the development director position, I was still wrestling with my ego, with redefined ideas of success. Taking that job was partly about proving I could change, that I could value purpose over prestige." She met my eyes directly. "But this promotion, executive director, it comes with prestige, a higher salary, public recognition. And I'm afraid that part of me is excited for those old, familiar reasons." I considered her words carefully. "Natalie, wanting recognition for your work isn't inherently wrong. The question is whether that's your primary motivation or a secondary benefit of doing something meaningful." "That's exactly what I'm struggling to answer," she admitted. "How do I know if I've truly changed or if I'm just channeling the same status-seeking impulses into a more socially acceptable direction?" Her vulnerability touched me deeply. 2 years ago, Natalie would never have voiced these doubts, would likely not even have recognized them within herself. Her capacity for self-reflection had grown immensely. "What specifically appeals to you about the executive director role?" I asked, "beyond the title or recognition?" She didn't hesitate. "The chance to scale our impact. We've been doing important work at the local level, but with climate change accelerating, we need coordinated regional approaches. I have ideas for collaboration across state lines, for building coalitions with unlikely allies, for engaging communities that have traditionally been left out of environmental conversations." As she spoke, Her entire demeanor transformed. Her eyes lit up, her hands gesturing emphatically to illustrate her points. This wasn't the calculated enthusiasm she'd once displayed when describing luxury property features to impress others. This was genuine passion. "I think you just answered your own question," I said gently when she paused for breath. She blinked. "What do you mean?" "Listen to yourself," I smiled. "You're not talking about corner offices or impressive titles. You're talking about impact, about work that matters to you deeply." She considered this, some tension visibly leaving her shoulders. "I suppose that's true. But how do I make sure I don't slip back into old patterns? Start measuring my worth by external validation rather than meaningful work?" "By continuing to question your motivations, exactly as you're doing now," I replied. The old Natalie would never have worried about this. She would have taken the promotion, bought a new car to celebrate, and made sure everyone knew about her impressive new title. She winced slightly, but nodded in acknowledgement. "The fact that you're sitting here, genuinely concerned about your intentions, is evidence of how much you've changed," I continued. "You've developed an internal compass that wasn't there before." "I still worry," she admitted, "that I'll disappoint myself, that I'll get seduced by the external trappings again." "Then build in safeguards," I suggested. "Regular check-ins with yourself. Maybe even with me, if that would help. Specific metrics for impact rather than personal advancement." She nodded slowly, considering. "I've actually been thinking about something along those lines. If I take this position, I want to establish an advisory council of community members from the frontline neighborhoods most affected by environmental issues. People whose perspectives are often overlooked. They would keep me accountable, make sure our work remains focused on genuine impact rather than what looks good in press releases." "That's brilliant," I said, impressed by her thoughtfulness. "And it's further evidence that you're approaching this from the right place." She smiled, a flicker of her old confidence returning, but now grounded in something more substantial than ego. "I'm going to accept the position," she decided, "and I'm going to work every day to make sure I deserve it." "You already do," I assured her. As she stood to leave, she surprised me with a tight hug. "Thank you for seeing me, the real me, even when I couldn't see myself clearly." After she left, I sat reflecting on our conversation. Natalie's journey had been remarkable. From someone who measured worth exclusively through material possessions and status symbols, to someone deeply concerned with the integrity of her motivations and the impact of her work. It was a transformation I wouldn't have believed possible 3 years ago. That evening, I received a text from her. "I officially accepted. Celebration dinner at our place this weekend? Nothing fancy, just family." I smiled at the nothing. Fancy clarification, another small sign of how much had changed. The old Natalie would have insisted on the most expensive restaurant in town, or hosted an elaborate catered affair at home to showcase her success. When I arrived at Natalie and Greg's home that Saturday, I was surprised to find not just family, but a small gathering of friends as well. Clara, now a sophomore in college studying environmental science, greeted me with a warm hug. Uncle Peter was there, looking more frail than I remembered, but his eyes still bright with intelligence. Greg was manning the grill, looking relaxed and content in a way he never had during their high-spending years. What struck me most was the diversity of the gathering. Natalie's colleagues from the coalition mingled with Greg's coworkers, Clara's college friends, and our extended family. It wasn't the carefully curated guest list of professionals and potential contacts that Natalie would once have assembled to impress. It was simply people they cared about, from various walks of life, brought together in genuine celebration. Natalie approached, handing me a glass of wine. "What do you think? Too much?" Clara insisted we needed proper celebration. "It's perfect," I assured her. "A genuine reflection of your life now." She smiled, surveying the gathering with evident satisfaction. "I realized something this week, preparing for the new role. I've been so focused on my own transformation, making sure my motivations are pure, that I'm not reverting to old patterns, that I almost missed the bigger picture. Which is that it was never really about me, she said simply. The most meaningful work rarely is. It's about what we contribute, what we build together, what we leave behind. As she spoke, I noticed Clara watching us from across the patio, an expression of quiet pride on her face. She caught my eye and raised her glass slightly in acknowledgement. Your daughter is proud of you, I observed, and not for the reasons you once thought mattered. Natalie followed my gaze, her expression softening. She told me something remarkable yesterday. She said watching me change careers, reconsider my values, start over in many ways, it taught her more than all my previous success ever did. That seeing me struggle to align my work with my evolving principles gave her permission to question her own path, to prioritize meaning over status. Children often learn more from our struggles than our achievements, I noted. I wish I'd understood that sooner, Natalie said. All those years trying to present a perfect image, when what she needed was to see authentic growth, mistakes, and all. Our conversation was interrupted as Greg called everyone to gather for dinner. The long tables set up in the backyard were simple but beautiful, decorated with autumn flowers and candles. As we took our seats, I found myself between Clara and one of Natalie's coalition colleagues, a soft-spoken woman named Diane who worked on community engagement in historically marginalized neighborhoods. Your sister is remarkable, Diane told me as we served ourselves from platters of grilled vegetables and locally sourced fish. When she first joined the coalition, some of us were skeptical. Her background in luxury real estate seemed disconnected from our work. But she's proven herself through genuine commitment and humility. She actually listens. She's learned a lot in recent years, I acknowledged. It shows, Diane nodded. There's nothing performative about her engagement, and that's rare, especially from people who come from, well, privilege. Midway through dinner, Greg stood and gently tapped his glass for attention. I hope you'll forgive a brief toast, he said, smiling warmly at his wife. To Natalie, whose courage in reinventing herself has inspired all of us. When we downsized our home and reassessed our priorities 3 years ago, I worried we were losing something essential. Instead, we found what truly matters. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table as glasses were raised. And if I may, Uncle Peter added, rising with some effort to his feet. A toast to both Bennett sisters. Emma, whose quiet integrity showed the way, and Natalie, whose willingness to change reminds us it's never too late to grow. I felt a flush of emotion as everyone raised their glasses again. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about the journey that had brought us here, the healing of old wounds, the genuine connection that had replaced decades of competition and misunderstanding. As dinner continued, Clara leaned over to me. Can I ask you something, Aunt Emma? Of course. Do you think people can really change? She asked, her young face serious. I mean, fundamentally change who they are? I considered the question carefully. I don't think we change who we are at our core, but we can absolutely change our priorities, our perspectives, our understanding of what matters. She nodded, thoughtfully. That's what happened with Mom, isn't it? She was always driven and ambitious and cared about recognition. Those traits didn't disappear. They just got redirected toward something meaningful. That's insightful, I said, impressed. By her perception, your mother's fundamental strengths remained the same. Her strategic thinking, her networking abilities, her determination. What changed was how she applied those strengths and what she valued. I'm thinking about this a lot lately, Clara admitted. In college, there's so much pressure to map out the perfect career, to pick a path and stick with it. But watching Mom reinvent herself in her 40s makes me realize life isn't that linear. It rarely is, I agreed. My own career evolved significantly over time, even though I stayed in the same field. What started as conventional financial advising gradually shifted toward ethical investing as my understanding of global challenges and personal values deepened. Clara sipped her water thoughtfully. Mom says your net worth revelation was the best thing that ever happened to her. Not because of the money part, but because it forced her to question everything she thought she knew about success. I smiled, touched by this characterization. Sometimes we need a significant disruption to see beyond our own limited perspective. I'm glad it happened, Clara said simply. I like who she is now, who we all are now. After dinner, as people broke into smaller conversational groups, I found myself alone with Greg for a rare private moment. He had changed too over these years, less anxious, more present, his natural warmth no longer overshadowed by the pressure of maintaining appearances. I never properly thanked you, he said quietly as we stood by the garden Natalie had planted in their new, more modest backyard. For what you did for our family. I didn't do anything intentionally, I demurred. The revelation at the lake house wasn't planned as some intervention. Maybe not, he acknowledged with a small smile. But afterward, you could have gloated, could have rejected Natalie's request for help, could have held her past behavior against her. Instead, you gave her exactly what she needed: honesty, accountability, and compassion. I was moved by his perception. She's my sister. Despite everything, that always mattered. Well, as her husband, I'm grateful, he said simply. I have my wife back, the woman I fell in love with before status and possessions became her primary focus. Maybe I even have myself back. As the evening drew to a close, guests gradually departed with warm hugs and promises to reconnect soon. Uncle Peter was staying the night in their guest room, and Clara would return to her campus apartment in the morning. I helped Natalie clear the last of the dishes, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of working alongside my sister. I've been thinking, she said as she handed me a plate to dry, about writing a book. Really? I was surprised. About what? About redefining success, she said. About the journey from external validation to meaningful contribution. Not as some self-help guru with all the answers, but as someone who got it wrong for decades before finding a better path. I think that could be powerful, I encouraged. Especially coming from someone who experienced both sides, the material, success that left you empty, and the meaningful work that truly satisfies. She nodded. That's what I'm thinking. So many people are trapped in the cycle I was, chasing status, accumulating possessions, competing with others, and still feeling somehow incomplete. If sharing my journey could help even a few people question that path earlier than I did, it would be a worthwhile contribution, I finished for her. Would you help me? She asked, a touch of vulnerability in her voice. Not to write it, but to make sure I'm being honest, not sugarcoating the difficult parts or presenting myself as wiser than I was. Of course, I agreed immediately. Though I think you have more clarity about your journey than you realize. Later, as I prepared to leave, Natalie walked me to my car. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights, a gentle autumn breeze carrying the scent of fallen leaves. I remember when I used to mock your car, she said suddenly, looking at my practical Honda. I thought it proved something about your failure, when all along it represented your freedom from exactly the kind of materialism that was trapping me. It's just a car, I smiled. A tool that gets me where I need to go reliably. That's exactly it, she said with unexpected intensity. It's just a car. A house is just a structure. Clothes are just fabric. I spent so many years imbuing these objects with the power to define my worth, to validate my existence. I was struck by the depth of her realization, how completely she had dismantled the value system that once governed her life. "The strangest part," she continued, "is that I don't miss any of it. The constant striving, the comparison, the anxiety that someone else might have more or better. It was exhausting." "Freedom often comes from letting go rather than acquiring more," I observed. "Something you understood long before I did," she acknowledged, "but I'm learning." As I drove home that night, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought us to this point. That hurtful video revealing how Natalie spoke about me behind my back could have been the final break in our already strained relationship. Instead, it had become the catalyst for profound transformation, not just in how she viewed me, but in how she understood herself and her place in the world. The truth about my net worth hadn't mattered because it proved her wrong about my financial success. It had mattered because it cracked open her rigid definition of success itself, creating space for new understanding to grow. And in that space, something beautiful had emerged: authentic connection, genuine purpose, and the kind of wealth that can't be measured in dollars. As I parked outside my apartment building, I noticed a text from Natalie. "Thank you for showing me a different way to live. Not through lectures or judgment, but through quiet example. I aspire to have even a fraction of your integrity. Love you, sis." I smiled as I typed my reply. "The greatest success is becoming who you're truly meant to be. By that measure, you're achieving remarkable things. Love you too." Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with painful revelations. And sometimes, what looks like failure through one lens is revealed to be success through another. Natalie had once told everyone I was the family failure, but in doing so, she had been failing herself, missing the opportunity to define success in terms of purpose, authenticity, and connection rather than possessions and appearances. Now, as we both moved forward on our respective paths, the old narratives had lost their power. We had written a new story together, one of growth, redemption, and the kind of wealth that truly matters. 5 years had passed since the lake house revelation. Life had taken unexpected turns for both Natalie and me, weaving our once parallel lives into a more interwoven tapestry. At 47, I found myself at a professional crossroads. My sustainable investment firm had grown beyond my expectations, now managing nearly $1 billion in assets across the Pacific Northwest. I'd been approached about acquisition offers from larger financial institutions, tempting propositions that would mean significant personal wealth, but potential compromise of the values that had guided my business from the beginning. The morning was unusually bright for Portland in November, sunlight streaming through the windows of my corner office as I reviewed the latest acquisition proposal. The numbers were impressive, the terms generous. Yet something held me back from signing. My contemplation was interrupted by a knock at my door. "Sorry to disturb you," my assistant said, "but your niece is here. She doesn't have an appointment, but she seems upset." I immediately set the paperwork aside. "Send her in, please." Clara entered a moment later, looking more like her, mother than ever at 22. She had Natalie's elegant features and confident posture, but there was something distinctly her own in her direct gaze and unpolished authenticity. Recently graduated from college with a degree in environmental science, she'd been working at a climate research institute while applying to graduate programs. "Aunt Emma," she said, her voice tight with emotion, "I need your advice." "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the comfortable chairs by the window rather than maintaining the formal distance of my desk. "What's going on?" She settled into a chair, clearly struggling to organize her thoughts. "I had a huge fight with Mom." This was surprising. In recent years, Natalie and Clara had developed a much healthier relationship, built on mutual respect rather than Natalie's former controlling approach. "About what?" I asked gently. Clara took a deep breath. I've been offered a research position. It's an amazing opportunity. Field work in Indonesia studying mangrove restoration as natural carbon capture. 2 years of hands-on experience before graduate school. That sounds perfect for you, I observed. So what's the problem? Mom doesn't think I should take it, Clara explained, frustration evident in her voice. She says it's too dangerous, too remote, that I'd be putting my career on hold. But this is exactly the kind of experience I need. It combines conservation with climate science and community engagement, everything I care about. I considered this carefully. And you're sure Natalie's objection is about danger and career interruption? Not something else? Clara frowned. What do you mean? Your mother has changed enormously over the years, I said. But parents often have complex reactions to their children's choices. Sometimes what seems like disapproval is actually fear, or even projection of their own regrets. I don't understand, Clara said. Mom's all about meaningful work now. She literally runs an environmental nonprofit. Why would she object to me doing field research that aligns perfectly with those values? It was a good question, one that revealed the limitations of Clara's perspective. She had known the transformed Natalie, the woman who had redefined her idea of success and purpose. She hadn't fully experienced the earlier version of her mother, the woman obsessed with status and appearances. Have you asked her directly what's really bothering her about this opportunity? I suggested. Clara looked somewhat sheepish. I may have. Stormed out before we got to that part of the conversation. I smiled sympathetically. Perhaps that's where you should start. I will, she nodded. But first I need to understand. Do you think I should take this position? Is Mom right that it's a detour from a more traditional career path? I considered my words carefully. Clara, one of the most important lessons I've learned is that there's rarely a single right path. What matters is whether the choice aligns with your values and helps you grow in the direction that's meaningful to you. That's what I think too, she said emphatically. Then I have a suggestion, I said. Before you talk to your mother again, write down exactly why this opportunity matters to you. Not just the professional benefits, but the deeper reasons. What it means to you personally, how it connects to your values, what you hope to learn beyond the technical skills. She nodded slowly. And then share that with Mom? Yes, I confirmed. Give her the chance to see this choice through your eyes, to understand what's driving you. And then ask her, genuinely ask her, what's behind her objection. Clara seemed to consider this thoughtfully. You think there's something she's not saying directly? I suspect there might be, I acknowledged. Your mother and I grew up with certain expectations about success and security. Even though Natalie has transformed her own perspective dramatically, it can be harder to release those concerns when it comes to her child. Clara was quiet for a moment, processing. Did you and Mom fight like this when you were younger? I laughed softly. Not exactly. We had a different kind of conflict. For many years, we were operating with completely different values, but never really discussing them openly. We judged each other based on our own metrics of success, without trying to understand the other's perspective. And then everything changed after the family reunion revelation, Clara said. She'd heard the story many times, how the truth about my financial success had forced Natalie to reconsider her assumptions about worth and status. That was a catalyst, I agreed. But the real change happened in the years that followed, when we both made the effort to truly understand each other, instead of competing or judging. Clara stood restlessly and moved to the window, looking out at the city below. I'm afraid, if I take this position in Indonesia, I'll disappoint her. And after everything she's been through, how hard she's worked to change, to be better. I don't want to hurt her. The vulnerability in her voice touched me deeply. Despite their past conflicts, Clara clearly cared profoundly about her mother's feelings. Taking a path that's right for you isn't a rejection of your mother or her values, I said gently. In fact, I suspect Natalie might be prouder than you realize once she understands your motivations. Clara turned back to me. Will you come to dinner tonight? Help mediate this conversation? You understand both of us in ways we sometimes don't understand ourselves. I smiled at her perception. I'd be honored. That evening, I arrived at Natalie and Greg's home with a sense of déjà vu. How many family discussions had I been part of in recent years? How many moments of growth and reconciliation? The modest but comfortable craftsman house they'd moved to years ago had become a genuine home, filled with warmth and authenticity rather than the showcased perfection of their former residence. Greg greeted me at the door, his expression relieved. Thank goodness you're here. They've been circling each other like wary cats all afternoon. Happy to help, I said, handing him the bottle of wine I'd brought. How are you doing with all this? He shrugged. I think Clara should go to Indonesia. It's an amazing opportunity, but I understand Natalie's concerns too. And those concerns are? I probed gently. Fear, mostly, he said simply. Fear of her being so far away in a relatively undeveloped area. Fear of something happening when we can't reach her easily. Fear of... He hesitated. Fear of what? I prompted. Of losing the relationship they've finally built, he admitted. Natalie worries that 2 years away during this crucial time will create distance between them. His insight confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't really about career trajectories or even physical danger. It was about emotional connection and Natalie's lingering insecurities. I found Natalie in the kitchen, preparing dinner with focused intensity. At 50, she remained striking, though the carefully maintained perfection of her appearance had softened into something more natural. The designer clothes had been replaced with quality basics, the elaborate hairstyles with a simple, elegant cut that suited her. Need any help? I offered. She looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I've got it under control. Clara's on the back porch if you want to check on her. In a minute, I said, leaning against the counter. How are you doing with all this? Her knife paused momentarily over the vegetables she was chopping. Did she tell you I'm being unreasonable? That I'm trying to hold her back? She told me you have concerns about her Indonesia opportunity, I replied neutrally, and that you two haven't fully discussed the reasons behind those concerns. Natalie sighed, setting down her knife. Emma, she wants to go to a remote island, halfway around the world for 2 years. Limited internet, periodic power outages, tropical diseases, political instability. Of course I have concerns. All valid, I acknowledged. But are those the only reasons you're hesitant? She gave me a sharp look. What are you suggesting? Just that sometimes our surface objections aren't the whole story, I said gently. Especially when it comes to our children's choices. Natalie was quiet for a long moment, resuming her methodical chopping. When did you get so insightful about parenting? You don't even have children. I've watched you parent Clara for 22 years, I replied. I've seen both the struggles and the triumphs, and I've observed how your relationship has healed and strengthened, especially in recent years. She nodded slowly. We worked hard for that. After years of pushing her to be what I thought she should be, of trying to shape her in my image, we finally have an authentic connection. She trusts me now. She shares things with me. Her voice caught slightly. I don't want to lose that. And you think her going to Indonesia would threaten your relationship? 2 years is a long time, she said quietly. And she'll be so isolated there. What if something happens? What if she needs us and we can't reach her? What if she changes in ways that create distance between us? The vulnerability in her voice was striking. This was not the Natalie of old, concerned about appearances and status. This was a mother genuinely afraid of losing connection with her daughter at a time when that connection had finally become healthy and meaningful. "Have you shared these concerns with Clara directly?" I asked. "Not exactly," she admitted. "We got stuck arguing about career implications and safety concerns. Perhaps tonight is an opportunity to have a more honest conversation," I suggested. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "You're right, as usual." She gestured toward the back porch. "Go talk to her while I finish dinner. Try to convince her I'm not reverting to my controlling ways." I found Clara sitting on the porch swing, staring out at the garden where autumn leaves drifted from the Japanese maple Natalie had planted when they first moved in. The tree had been small then, a symbol of new beginnings. Now it stood tall and vibrant, its deep red leaves catching the last of the day's light. "Your mother's worried about losing connection with you," I said without preamble, settling beside her on the swing. "Not about your career trajectory, or even primarily about physical dangers." Clara looked surprised. "Losing connection? But we talk about everything now. We're closer than we've ever been." "Exactly," I nodded. "After years of struggle, you've built something precious." She's afraid that 2 years of limited communication from a remote location might erode that connection. Clara was quiet, processing this perspective. "I hadn't thought about it that way," she finally admitted. "I've been so focused on the opportunity itself, on what it means for my future." "That's natural," I assured her. "You're at a stage of life where looking forward is appropriate. Your mother is at a stage where she's more aware of how quickly time passes, how relationships can shift unexpectedly." "So you think I shouldn't go?" she asked, uncertainty in her voice. "I didn't say that," I clarified. "I think you should make this decision based on what truly matters to you, with full awareness of what it might cost and how you might mitigate those costs. Like finding ways to stay connected despite the distance," she said thoughtfully. "Exactly. If this opportunity aligns with your deeper purpose, then the question becomes not whether to take it, but how to honor both that purpose and your relationship with your mother while doing so." Clara nodded slowly. "I've been approaching this all wrong, fighting to win her approval instead of seeking to understand her concerns." "A very human response," I smiled. "One your mother and I have certainly been guilty of in our time." Dinner. That evening became a turning point. Rather than a battleground of competing perspectives, the meal evolved into a thoughtful exploration of fears, hopes, and possibilities. Natalie spoke with remarkable honesty about her fear of losing the hard-won connection with her daughter. Clara shared the deeper reasons this research opportunity called to her. Not just career advancement, but genuine passion for work that could make a tangible difference in both environmental science and local communities. "I'm not running away," Clara assured her mother at one point, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I'm running toward something important, but you and Dad will always be my home base, no matter where I am." Natalie squeezed her hand, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm being selfish, I know. I should be encouraging you to spread your wings." "It's not selfish to want to stay connected to your daughter," I interjected gently. "It's human." "What? If we created a concrete plan," Greg suggested. "Regular communication schedules, emergency protocols, visits when possible?" The tension in the room visibly eased as the conversation shifted from whether Clara should take the position to how they would maintain their family bonds if she did. By dessert, they were discussing practical solutions: satellite phones, scheduled video calls, planned visits during Clara's research breaks. "I'm proud of you," Natalie finally said, looking directly at her daughter. "Not because you're following in my footsteps or meeting some external standard of success, but because you're brave enough to follow your own path, to choose purpose over convenience." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "Really?" You're okay with this? I'm terrified, Natalie admitted with a small laugh. But yes, I'm okay with it. More than okay. I'm inspired by it. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how far we had all come. 5 years ago, such a conversation would have been unimaginable. Natalie would have either forbidden Clara's plans outright or judged them solely on how they reflected on her as a parent. Clara would have either submitted reluctantly or rebelled destructively. Neither would have had the emotional tools to truly hear the other's perspective. The transformation wasn't just in Natalie's values or priorities, it was in her capacity. For authentic connection, for vulnerability, for putting relationship above being right. She had learned through our own reconciliation and her ongoing growth that true strength often lies in acknowledging fears rather than disguising them as logical objections. The next morning, I received a text from Natalie. Thank you for last night, for helping us actually hear each other. Clara's accepting the position with my full support. I'm scheduling a trip to visit her field site next summer. Who would have thought I'd ever be excited about staying in a research station with limited plumbing? I smiled at the self-awareness in her message. The old Natalie would never have considered accommodations without luxury amenities. The new Natalie prioritized connection over comfort, meaning over status. My phone rang moments later, not Natalie, but my assistant. The acquisition team is here for your 10 o'clock, she informed me. They're hoping for an answer today. I glanced at the paperwork still sitting on my desk. The generous offer to purchase my firm, to fold our ethical investment approach into a much larger financial institution. The numbers were impressive, the personal payout substantial. But Clara's words from the previous evening echoed in my mind. I'm not running away. I'm running towards something important. Wasn't that precisely what I had done all these years? Run toward work that aligned with my values rather than simply maximizing profit? Built a firm that proved ethical investing could be both financially successful and personally fulfilling. Tell them I'm ready to meet, I told my assistant, making my decision in that moment. But they should be prepared for a counteroffer. Not a counteroffer for more money, but for something more valuable. Autonomy to maintain our ethical standards, guaranteed positions for my team members who shared our vision, dedicated funds for expanding our community impact initiatives. If they wanted my firm, they would need to understand that its value lay not just in its financial performance, but in its purpose and integrity. As I gathered my notes for the meeting, I reflected on the unexpected ways our family story had unfolded. What had begun with hurt and revelation, Natalie's mocking video, my unexpected financial disclosure, had catalyzed growth that continued to ripple outward, touching not just our relationship but our professional lives, our extended family, and now the next generation. Natalie had once told everyone I was the family failure because I didn't display the conventional trappings of success. That painful judgment had eventually transformed into the greatest gift, forcing both of us to examine what truly constituted success, worth, and meaning. The journey that followed had led us both to lives richer in purpose and connection than either of us could have imagined. As I walked into the conference room to meet the acquisition team, I carried that awareness with me. Whatever path this negotiation took, whatever decision emerged, it would be guided not by external metrics of success, but by the internal compass that had never steered me wrong. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from our most painful experiences. And sometimes, what looks like failure through one lens becomes the catalyst for the most meaningful kind of success through another. 10 years had passed since that fateful lake house moment when my financial success was revealed. A decade of transformation, growth, and healing that had rewritten not just my relationship with Natalie, but the entire framework of our family dynamics. Life had taken us in directions neither of us could have predicted. After careful negotiation, I had sold my investment firm, but on my terms, maintaining ethical standards, and securing positions for my loyal team members. The substantial proceeds had allowed me to establish a foundation focused on economic empowerment for underserved communities, work that engaged my financial expertise while creating tangible social impact. Natalie had flourished as executive director of the Northwest Environmental Coalition for several years before transitioning to consulting work that allowed her more flexibility. Her book, Redefining Success: From Status to Significance, had become a surprise bestseller, leading to speaking engagements across the country where she shared her journey from materialism to meaning with disarming honesty. Clara had completed her research position in Indonesia and gone on to earn a PhD in environmental science. Now 32, she led an innovative research lab developing nature-based solutions to climate challenges. She had her mother's determination and strategic mind, tempered by an authenticity and purpose that was uniquely her own. The Bennett family had expanded in unexpected ways as well. In my early 50s, I had met Michael, a widowed architect with a passion for sustainable design. Our connection had been immediate and profound. After 2 years of dating, we had married in a simple ceremony at Uncle Peter's lake house, the very place where our family's transformation had begun. Now, 5 years into our marriage, we had built a life together that balanced meaningful work with genuine connection. On a crisp autumn morning, I stood in the kitchen of the craftsman bungalow Michael and I had lovingly restored, preparing for a family gathering unlike any we'd had before. Uncle Peter had passed away peacefully 3 months earlier at the age of 84, leaving behind a legacy of wisdom and the lake house property that had been placed in trust years ago. Today, the extended family would gather there one last time before the property transitioned to its new purpose. My phone chimed with a message from Natalie. On our way. Greg insists we're running late, but we're actually ahead of schedule. Should we stop for anything? I smiled at her message. Such a small thing, but it reflected the ongoing evolution of her character. The old Natalie would never have offered to stop for supplies, would have expected others to handle such details. We're all set, I replied. Drive safely. Michael appeared in the doorway, casually elegant in jeans and a sweater, his silver hair catching the morning light. Ready to head out? Everything's packed in the car. I nodded, taking a final look around our home. It feels strange, doesn't it? The last family gathering at the lake house. Not the end, he reminded me gently. Just a transformation, like so many others in your family story. He was right, of course. Uncle Peter's passing had prompted us to reimagine the future of the beloved property. After thoughtful discussion among all family members, we had decided to convert the lake house into a retreat center for environmental education and leadership development, a place where Clara's research team could host workshops, where Natalie could run programs on sustainable leadership, where local schools could bring students to learn about ecosystems and conservation. The family would still have access for reunions, but the property would now serve a greater purpose. The 2-hour drive to the lake passed in comfortable conversation. Michael had known our family story from the beginning, the years of competition and misunderstanding, the revelation that changed everything, the gradual healing and growth that followed. He had observed with keen insight how those early patterns sometimes re-emerged in subtle ways during family gatherings, and how Natalie and I had learned to recognize and redirect them with humor and grace. "What's on your mind?" he asked as we turned onto the familiar winding road that led to the lake. "You've been quiet the last few miles." "I was thinking about Uncle Peter," I admitted. "About something he said years ago, the night Natalie mocked me in that video, and it was forwarded to me. I called him, upset, not sure how to respond. He told me that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the opportunity to see themselves clearly." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "Wise man." "At the time, I thought he was just offering comfort," I continued. "But looking back, I realize he understood something profound about transformation. That it rarely happens without a moment of painful clarity, a mirror held up that reflects back something we've been avoiding seeing in ourselves. And that video, and your subsequent revelation at the lake house, became that mirror for Natalie, Michael observed. For both of us, really, I acknowledged. It forced me to examine why I had kept my financial success private for so long, why I had allowed her mischaracterization to stand unchallenged. There was pride in my silence, too. A different kind than Natalie's, but pride nonetheless. As we pulled up to the lake house, I was struck by how unchanged it appeared on the outside. The same cedar siding weathered to a silvery gray, the same wide porch overlooking the water, the same ancient pine trees standing sentinel. Yet I knew the interior had already begun its transformation, with rooms being reconfigured for classroom and workshop spaces while maintaining the warm character that made it special. Natalie and Greg had arrived just before us and were unloading their car when we pulled in. Clara's vehicle was there too, along with several cars belonging to cousins and other relatives. Perfect timing, Natalie called, approaching with a warm smile. At 60, she remained striking, though the carefully maintained perfection of her younger years had given way to a more natural elegance. The designer clothes and perfect makeup had been replaced by casual comfort and an authentic presence that suited her far better. We embraced briefly before heading inside, where family members were already gathering in the great room. The furniture had been rearranged to accommodate everyone, with the original rustic dining table at the center, surrounded by various chairs brought in from other rooms. Clara greeted us warmly, introducing her partner James, an oceanographer she had met during her research work. Other family members filtered in, cousins with their spouses and children, Aunt Margaret now using a walker but sharp as ever, younger generations I was still getting to know. When everyone had arrived, I moved to the center of the room, feeling a momentary flutter of nerves. Public speaking had never been my strength. That had always been Natalie's domain. But as trustee of the property and executor of Uncle Peter's estate, this moment fell to me. Thank you all for coming today, I began, my voice steady despite my nerves. As you know, we're gathered not only to remember Uncle Peter and his legacy, but to celebrate the next chapter for this special place that has meant so much to our family. I gestured to the large architectural renderings displayed on easels. Nearby, plans for the retreat center that would honor the property's character while adapting it for its new purpose. The Peter Bennett Center for Environmental Leadership will welcome its first groups next spring, I continued. But before that transformation is complete, Uncle Peter wanted us to gather one last time as a family in this space, to share memories and look toward the future. What followed was a remarkable afternoon of storytelling, some tales familiar, others surprising, all woven together into the tapestry of our shared history. Aunt Margaret recalled summers at the lake when she and Uncle Peter were children. Cousins shared memories of learning to swim off the dock or catching their first fish. Clara spoke eloquently about how the natural setting had inspired her career path in environmental science. When it came time for Natalie to speak, she rose with the poise that had always characterized her, but with a warmth and authenticity that reflected her growth. I have a confession to make, she began, smiling slightly. For many years, I saw this place primarily as a status symbol, a property to be acquired and shown off rather than a living piece of our family history. She glanced at me briefly before continuing. It took a significant wake-up call for me to recognize what truly matters, not just about this place, but about success, family, and purpose. She shared briefly about her journey from material focus to meaningful contribution, how the transformation of her values had led to more authentic relationships and more fulfilling work. It was a story many in the room knew, but hearing it connected specifically to the lake house gave it new resonance. Uncle Peter witnessed that transformation, she concluded, and in his quiet way, he encouraged it. Converting this property into a center for environmental education and leadership development isn't just practical use of a family asset. It's a perfect reflection of how our family's values have evolved over time. As the afternoon continued, I found myself on the dock with Clara, watching the sun lower toward the western hills, casting golden light across the water. James had joined Natalie and Greg in a tour of the property, discussing potential research, applications for various features of the lakeside ecosystem. "It's strange to think this all started with a hurtful video," Clara observed, echoing my earlier thoughts. "That moment could have destroyed your relationship with Mom permanently." "It could have," I agreed. "But sometimes what seems like an ending is actually the beginning of something better than we could have imagined." She nodded thoughtfully. "Mom's book helped a lot of people, you know. I meet them at conferences sometimes, people who read her story and recognize themselves in her former values, her focus on external validation. They tell me how it changed their perspective, helped them reconsider what really matters. That doesn't surprise me," I smiled. "Authentic transformation has a way of rippling outward, touching lives beyond our immediate circle." "The best kind of legacy," Clara agreed. As evening approached, the family gathered for a final meal around the extended table. The conversation flowed easily, generations mingling, shared history providing context for new connections. I looked around at these beloved faces, Natalie and Greg, Clara and James, Michael beside me, extended family filling every chair, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. My sister had once told everyone I was the family failure. That painful moment, born of her own insecurity and misplaced values, had initiated a journey none of us could have anticipated. The revelation of my financial success had mattered not because it proved her wrong, but because it created an opening for something much more valuable: authentic connection, redefined purpose, and the courage to grow beyond limiting perspectives. As we raised our glasses in a toast to Uncle Peter and the future of the lake house, I caught Natalie's eye across the table. The understanding that passed between us needed no words. We had traveled so far from those days of competition and misunderstanding, building something neither of us could have created alone. A family culture based on authentic connection rather than comparison, on contribution rather than acquisition. Sometimes the most painful moments contain the seeds of our greatest transformation. And sometimes what looks like failure through one lens becomes, through the clarifying perspective of time and growth, the foundation for the most meaningful kind of success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.